the sun rises over the jagged peaks of Mount Parnassus, spilling golden light over a landscape that has witnessed centuries of secrets, devotion, and terror. In the distance, the temple of Apollo emerges from the mist like a vision half-formed, its white marble columns catching the morning glow, serene and majestic. To the outside world, Delphi is a place of awe, a sanctuary of wisdom where mortals seek divine guidance. But behind its pristine facade lies a darker truth, a world of whispers, shadows, and unspeakable visions that haunted the women chosen to speak for the gods. These were not ordinary seers. They were Pythias, vessels of Apollo himself, bound to a fate of ecstasy and horror, their minds caught between mortal frailty and the divine's incomprehensible will. Every breath they drew within these sacred walls carried the weight of prophecy, a weight heavier than iron, sharper than any blade. To understand Delphi, one must step beyond the myths and legends that surround it, beyond the polished stories told to kings and travelers. Here, in the trembling halls of the temple, the air was thick with more than incense. It shimmered with fear and expectation. Visitors came seeking knowledge of their fates, of wars and plagues, of victories and betrayals. They left both enlightened and terrified, sometimes haunted by the Pythia's words as much as she was haunted by the visions themselves. For those who spoke for Apollo, there was no respite. Their existence was a constant negotiation between devotion and terror, between clarity and madness. Every prophecy was both gift and curse, every vision a journey into a world of impossible truths and unimaginable horrors. The Pythia's role was both exalted and horrifying. She sat atop a tripod over a fissure in the earth, from which mysterious vapors curled like living shadows. These fumes, unknown to the ancients yet potent, seeped into her lungs, igniting her mind and body in ways no ordinary human could endure. In these moments, she was said to lose all sense of herself, becoming a conduit for forces beyond comprehension. Her body trembled, her voice warped, and her words, cryptic, poetic, terrifying, carried the authority of a god. For those who watched, it was a spectacle of wonder. For the Pythia, it was a passage into a world where fear and ecstasy intertwined so tightly that one could not survive the experience unchanged. Those who claimed to have witnessed her trances often spoke of a mixture of awe and dread, as if they had glimpsed something at the edge of human understanding and immediately sensed the danger in that knowledge. The visions themselves were not gentle or comforting. They were vivid, brutal, and unrelenting. Apollo did not whisper riddles or offer soft guidance. He revealed futures in fragments, in images of fire, blood, serpents, and shadows that slithered just beyond reason. The Pythia's eyes would widen as these visions overtook her, as if she were seeing not only the fates of men but the hidden mechanisms of the universe itself, dark, chaotic, and merciless. Ancient writers hint at her terror, at the trembling that racked her body when confronted with what she could barely comprehend. Imagine the weight of seeing empires collapse, families destroyed, loved ones betrayed, all in a single, breathless moment. For the Pythia, it was a crucible of mind and soul, a test of endurance that left scars invisible to the eyes of ordinary mortals. Yet, despite the horror, there was an undeniable beauty to this terror. The temple itself, perched on the slopes of the sacred mountain, seemed to pulse with life. Light and shadow danced across its stones, creating a contrast that mirrored the duality of the Pythia's existence. Divine inspiration intertwined with human suffering. Every prophecy, every trembling utterance, was a testament to the impossible demands of faith, to the fine line between devotion and annihilation. Those who entered the temple came for guidance but often found themselves reflecting on the fragility of the human mind, the peril of seeking truths too vast for mortal comprehension. In this place, fear was inseparable from awe, and reverence carried the sting of terror. The Pythia's story begins here, in this liminal space between the mortal and divine, between beauty and horror. The visions that haunted her were not mere allegories. They were living, breathing forces that shaped the fate of nations and the psyche of those who served Apollo. As the temple breathed with incense, echoes of chants, and the whispers of those who had come seeking answers, the Pythia prepared for another encounter with the unimaginable. Every prophecy demanded a price, every vision exacted a toll, and every utterance reminded the world that even the most sacred knowledge could be terrifying beyond measure. In Delphi, the line between enlightenment and madness was not just blurred, it was obliterated. The air inside the Temple of Apollo was not merely fragrant with burning laurel and incense, it was heavy with something older, something unseen, a presence that seemed to twist the very soul of anyone who entered. Locals whispered of a fissure in the earth beneath the temple, a yawning crack from which strange vapors emerged, curling like serpents into the Pythia's lungs. These were no ordinary fumes. Ancient texts hint at their intoxicating, hallucinogenic power, though the ancients could not explain their true origin. Some spoke of the spirit of the earth, a divine breath that transformed the human mind. Modern scientists speculate that these gases, likely ethylene or other naturally occurring compounds, had hallucinatory effects, but for the people of Delphi, the Pythia's visions were beyond science. They were sacred, terrifying, and absolute. The process of becoming the oracle was both ritualized and brutal. The Pythia was often a mature woman, chosen for her purity, her resilience, and most importantly, her ability to withstand the horrors of the temple's trance. She would fast for days, cleansing the body, emptying herself of mortal distractions, until her mind was a fragile vessel. Priests guided her to the tripod that hovered over the fissure, a precarious perch from which she would gaze into realms beyond the living. There, inhaling the rising mists, she entered a state that straddled ecstasy and terror. Accounts describe her body as trembling uncontrollably, eyes rolling, lips quivering with unformed syllables. To the untrained eye, she seemed possessed. To the devout, she was Apollo incarnate, a bridge between the human and the divine. Yet, the Pythia's experiences were far from benign. The fumes unleashed visions that could shred the mind. She saw worlds that did not exist, creatures that defied reason, and events yet to come, vivid in terrifying detail. Some described serpents that writhed in impossible patterns, serpents that whispered secrets no human mind was meant to hold. Others recalled fire that devoured cities, shadows that stretched into infinity, and faces of loved ones contorted in betrayal and agony. Each vision was like a fragment of a cosmic puzzle, impossible to understand fully, leaving the Pythia exhausted, trembling, and sometimes broken for days afterward. Her body endured physical strain as well. Convulsions, fainting, and profound fatigue were common, a testament to the terrifying potency of the experience. The oracle's trances were not private spectacles. The temple was crowded with those seeking guidance. Kings, generals, and envoys came from far and wide, their eyes full of hope, fear, and desperation. They demanded answers, yet the Pythia could offer nothing without first surrendering to the terror within. The hall trembled with a dual energy. Awe and dread intermingled as those present watched a human being consumed by the invisible forces of the divine. Her voice, when it emerged, was fragmented and melodic, a rhythm of incomprehensible words that priests translated into prophecy. Sometimes, the words were ambiguous, filled with metaphor and poetic enigma. Other times, they were blunt, horrifying, and eerily precise. Regardless of clarity, every utterance carried the weight of something far beyond human comprehension. In many ways, the Pythia's power was inseparable from her suffering. The trance induced by the sacred gases was a doorway into terror, forcing her to confront visions that mortals would recoil from. Unlike dreams, these were not filtered by imagination or desire. They were raw, unmediated glimpses of the possible, the probable, and the impossible. Some scholars speculate that the intensity of these experiences could explain why many Pythias were reluctant to speak outside the temple, haunted by the things they had seen. It was as if each prophecy left a scar on the mind, an indelible mark that reminded them of their mortality even as they channeled a god's voice. The danger of the experience extended beyond the Pythia herself. Those who relied on her guidance were also drawn into the terror. Tales survive of kings who became obsessed, unable to act until the oracle had spoken again, their lives dominated by visions they did not understand. Prophecies of war and plague, betrayal and death, twisted through the minds of those who waited, creating an atmosphere of dread that enveloped the entire sanctuary. The Pythia was both healer and harbinger, a conduit whose own suffering radiated outward, shaping the destiny of men and nations alike. Yet, despite the fear and exhaustion, there was a magnetic allure to her trances. Observers described a strange beauty in the chaos, the trembling body, the wild eyes, the almost hypnotic rhythm of her speech. It was as if terror itself had become art, a living performance orchestrated by forces beyond human understanding. In that space, the sacred and the terrifying were inseparable, the lines between hallucination, divine inspiration, and psychological torment blurred until one could no longer tell where the human ended and the divine began. This was Delphi's secret, a place where knowledge demanded sacrifice, where seeing beyond the veil exacted a price in both body and soul. The Pythia's visions, born from the mist and smoke, were not merely tools for guidance, they were experiences of forbidden knowledge. To inhale those fumes was to confront the fragile boundaries of human perception, to see the world as it might be, beautiful, terrifying, and cruelly inevitable. For the Pythia, each session was a descent into a personal hell, balanced precariously by the reverence of those who awaited her words. The temple of Apollo, so pristine and radiant in the light, concealed within it a crucible of fear and ecstasy, where the mind and body were stretched to their limits in service of a god whose intentions were inscrutable. And yet, this was only the beginning. The visions would grow darker, more relentless, as the Pythia journeyed deeper into the mysteries that haunted her, and Delphi itself became a stage where terror and divinity danced in terrifying harmony. The burden of knowing the future is heavier than any crown, more piercing than any blade, and for the Pythia, it was a weight she could never set down. Each trance was not a fleeting encounter with divinity, it was an immersion into chaos, a confrontation with visions so vivid and horrifying that they threatened to unravel her mind entirely. She did not simply see events, she experienced them as if each war, betrayal, or plague coursed through her own body. The lines between the self and the vision blurred, leaving her in a liminal space where fear and awe coexisted in a relentless, almost unbearable tension. Ancient accounts hint at moments when the Pythia screamed or fainted mid-vision, unable to contain the terror that surged through her, yet she was expected to rise again, to interpret the incomprehensible, and to speak truths no mortal could fully endure. The Pythia's isolation was profound. Even within the bustling temple, she was alone, separated by the sheer intensity of her trance from anyone who sought guidance. Kings and generals came with gold, prayers, and pleas, yet none could truly share in the horror she faced. Her body and mind were vessels for Apollo's will, but vessels are not immune to shattering. Historical accounts describe her hands trembling for hours afterward, her speech incoherent, her dreams invaded by the visions she had been forced to witness. Sometimes, she would see entire cities consumed in flames, rivers of blood, or entire armies reduced to ash. Other times, the horrors were subtler, yet no less piercing, the betrayal of friends, the anguish of loved ones, the slow unraveling of everything she had known as inevitable forces of fate advanced like shadowy predators. The psychological toll was immense. Scholars have speculated that the Pythia suffered from what we might now recognize as trauma, depression, and post-traumatic stress, though none of these words existed in the ancient world. She inhabited a space where time and memory were fractured, where the line between prophecy and hallucination was nearly imperceptible. Her visions did not respect boundaries, they bled into waking life, influencing her every thought and decision. There are stories of Pythias who became paranoid, who feared their own reflections, who shunned human contact for weeks after a particularly intense trance. In some cases, it is said that women broke completely under the weight of what they had seen, forced to leave the temple, their minds forever haunted by Apollo's relentless gaze. Yet the burden was not hers alone. Those who came to Delphi were entwined in the Pythia's terror, whether they realized it or not. The messages she delivered were often cryptic, symbolic, and terrifying. Kings received omens of defeat and death. Generals were warned of treachery within their ranks. The language of prophecy was deliberately ambiguous, a deliberate reflection of the incomprehensible forces behind it. But ambiguity did not lessen the impact. If anything, it amplified the fear, leaving mortals to obsess over every word, to project their anxieties and hopes onto the oracle's utterances. In that way, the Pythia's torment rippled outward, shaping entire societies with the psychic weight of her visions. One trembled not merely for what she said, but for what she had seen, and in some ways, what she had suffered. The visions themselves were a twisted theater. Some were nightmarish in scale, cities collapsing, armies slaughtered, natural disasters swallowing the land. Others were intimate and horrifying, personal in ways that left the Pythia racked with guilt and fear. She might see a man's betrayal of his family, a friend's secret violence, or the slow, inexorable decay of a noble house. Each image was imbued with the divine certainty of inevitability. She did not interpret or embellish, she witnessed. The human mind is ill-equipped to bear such knowledge, and the Pythia paid dearly for the burden. Her health suffered, her body betrayed her, and yet the temple demanded she return again and again to the tripod, to inhale the sacred mists, and to confront the horrors that lay beyond mortal comprehension. There was also a cruel paradox in her role. To be the Pythia was to be both revered and feared. She was celebrated for her divine insight, yet the very insight that made her powerful also isolated her. She could never fully explain what she saw, nor could she share the terror she endured without risking disbelief, mockery, or worse. The priests who guided her often acted as intermediaries, translating her incoherent utterances into prophecy, but even they could not penetrate the true depth of her suffering. In essence, she was alone, not just physically, but spiritually, mentally, and emotionally. Every session left her more fragile, yet the demands of faith and duty were relentless, unyielding as the gods themselves. The Pythia's burden was also moral. She was forced to witness events that mortals might have preferred to remain hidden: crimes, betrayals, impending death, and yet she had no choice but to reveal them. To withhold prophecy was considered a sacrilege, to deliver it, a sentence of psychological torment. Imagine seeing a city's destruction before it happens, knowing you must convey the truth to the leaders who will shape the fate of thousands. Imagine experiencing the intimate betrayals of families, the slow decay of entire bloodlines, knowing you cannot interfere, cannot prevent it, and cannot even escape it. Every vision imposed a moral weight as crushing as its psychological impact. And yet, in the midst of this terror, there was an unearthly beauty. The visions, though horrifying, were glimpses of a universe beyond human understanding. Patterns of cause and effect revealed themselves in ways that defied earthly logic. The Pythia, in her suffering, became a mirror for the divine, fragile, trembling, yet illuminated by glimpses of cosmic truth. There is a strange poetry in the horror she endured. Each tremor, each scream, each word uttered in a trance was a testament to the human capacity to confront the unknowable, to endure suffering while transmitting insight. By the time the Pythia emerged from her trance, she was both diminished and exalted, haunted and revered. Her body bore the marks of terror, her mind carried the weight of futures she could not escape, her soul was forever tethered to the divine in a way that no ordinary human could comprehend. The burden of knowledge was absolute, relentless, and terrifying, and yet it was precisely this burden that made Delphi a place of such powerful fear and awe. It was here, in these private moments of madness and revelation, that the Oracles of Delphi revealed the paradox of prophecy, that to know the future is to live in unending terror, and yet, through terror, to touch the sublime. The visions of the Pythia were not gentle whispers or cryptic riddles meant to comfort the faithful. They were violent, unrelenting, and often horrifyingly precise, as if the gods themselves were performing a cruel theater at the edge of human understanding. She did not simply see battles, she experienced them. Armies clashed with a soundless fury, shields shattered, and swords carved impossible patterns in the air. The smell of smoke and blood seemed to fill her senses even though she remained physically tethered to the marble temple floor. Cities crumbled into ash before her eyes, temples were desecrated, and rivers of blood ran through streets that had once held children laughing in the sun. These visions were not metaphorical. They were immersive, sensory experiences that left her trembling long after the trance ended. The Pythia did not merely predict disaster, She entered it, felt its heat and terror, and carried its weight into the world of mortals. Her visions extended beyond war to the intimate horrors of human behavior. She would witness betrayal among the closest of allies, families torn apart by greed or envy, lovers destroyed by secrets that would never be revealed until too late. It is said that the Pythia sometimes foresaw murders before they occurred, the blade suspended in the air, the moment of final breath hanging like a shadow over the victim's life. Such visions left her not only exhausted but morally burdened, for she could neither intervene nor shield those she saw condemned. The knowledge was a torment, a form of psychic crucifixion that no ordinary human could survive without fracturing. And yet she had no choice. The gods demanded the truth, even if the truth was unbearable. The divine cruelty in these visions was almost theatrical in its precision. Apollo did not show the future as a static tableau, he revealed it as a process, a series of unfolding horrors that played out with relentless inevitability. A city might fall in a vision, but first its leaders would betray one another, its citizens would panic, and its walls would crack under forces unseen. A king might be betrayed by the servant he trusted most, a family destroyed by secrets carefully hidden for generations. The Pythia became the unwilling audience to the gods' deliberate orchestration of suffering. Some scholars speculate that these visions were meant as moral instruction, a reminder of the consequences of ambition, hubris, and impiety, but for the human mind, they were often simply terror incarnate. The Pythia's trance was a sensory overload. She saw colors that had no names, sounds that had no pitch, and shapes that defied earthly geometry. Shadows slithered across the vision like serpents, fire roared in impossible patterns, and faces of the living and dead merged into grotesque tableaus that left her gasping for breath. She experienced fear on multiple planes, fear for herself, for those she loved, and for entire nations that seemed to teeter on the edge of annihilation. This multidimensional terror was unique to her role. No ordinary human could perceive future events so vividly, nor could they endure the psychic weight of inevitability that accompanied such perception. The visions were a form of divine horror, designed to remind mortals that the world was ruled by forces far beyond their comprehension. Even more disturbing were the glimpses of events that may never have been intended for human eyes. The Pythia sometimes saw the chaos of natural forces, earthquakes splitting the earth, storms consuming coastlines, diseases spreading invisibly yet with lethal precision. She saw omens and patterns in the heavens that foreshadowed calamities invisible to the ordinary eye. These cosmic visions were terrifying not only because of their scale but because of their inevitability. Human effort seemed meaningless, futile, like struggling against a current that could not be stopped. In these moments, the Pythia's body would convulse, her eyes rolling back as she absorbed the enormity of the universe's cruelty, and the priests around her would tremble, translating the words of one broken human into prophecy for those who dared to seek it. Yet the terror was compounded by ambiguity. The Pythia's visions were rarely literal. Battles could symbolize political betrayal, natural disasters could foreshadow famine, deaths of individuals might represent the collapse of entire bloodlines. Mortals, desperate for guidance, often misinterpreted her words, twisting them to suit ambition or fear. Kings waged wars based on cryptic pronouncements, generals hesitated, paralyzed by prophecy. The Pythia, meanwhile, remained trapped between the incomprehensible truth she had witnessed and the mortal inability to grasp it fully. Her suffering, therefore, was twofold: the visions themselves and the knowledge that those who depended on her could never truly understand them. The Pythia's visions also had a haunting aesthetic, a beauty that made the terror almost irresistible. Even as she saw cities collapse, she perceived patterns in their destruction, rhythms in chaos, and symmetry in devastation. There was an artistry to Apollo's cruelty, a deliberate weaving of horror and beauty that left her simultaneously awed and terrified. Those who watched her emerge from trance spoke of the strange luminescence in her eyes, the cadence of her trembling voice, and the eerie grace with which she delivered prophecies that would seal the fates of kings. It was as if terror itself had been sanctified, made sublime through the filter of divine vision. And yet, for all its horror, the Pythia's role was necessary. Mortals believed the visions were the voice of the divine, a glimpse into a future they could not otherwise perceive. In her suffering, she became a bridge between worlds, the fragile, mortal realm of human endeavor and the infinite, terrifying domain of the gods. Each vision, each trembling utterance, was both a gift and a punishment. She alone bore the psychic toll of foresight, and yet, without her, the world would be blind to the consequences of ambition, betrayal, and divine will. In the end, the visions left the Pythia irrevocably changed. Her mind carried the memory of destruction, her body bore the scars of terror, and her soul was permanently tethered to forces beyond comprehension. To witness the future was to live in unending tension, caught between awe and horror, beauty and cruelty. Delphi, bathed in marble light and shrouded in mist, was a sanctuary not of comfort but of confrontation, a place where humans were forced to witness the terrifying, unpredictable, and sublime machinery of the cosmos through the eyes of one trembling oracle. And it was here, in these moments of unrelenting horror, that the world learned that the price of prophecy was the very sanity of the human mind. The burden of prophecy was not merely mental, it was a physical crucible as well. The Pythia's body endured horrors that were invisible to those who worshipped her from afar. Days before she ascended the tripod, she would fast, purging herself of sustenance to prepare for the visions that awaited. Her body, weakened and trembling, became a vessel for forces far beyond human comprehension. Priests oversaw strict rituals, purifications in water, fumigations with sacred herbs, and periods of isolation, all designed to ready her for the trance, but also to separate her from the comforts of mortal life. She was expected to surrender herself entirely, her mind, her body, and even her will, to the divine currents that would surge through her. And yet, no preparation could truly shield her from the torment of what she would experience. Once seated upon the tripod, her senses were assaulted. The fissure beneath her exhaled fumes that had a maddening effect on both mind and body. They induced convulsions, disorientation, and a profound vulnerability, leaving her at the mercy of visions that were both intoxicating and terrifying. The trembling was not theatrical, it was the body's natural response to forces it could not control. Her hands would quiver, her knees buckle, and her voice emerge in fragmented syllables that no mortal ear could decipher until interpreted by the priests. Many Pythias collapsed mid-trance, overwhelmed by the intensity of the experience, only to be urged to rise again, for the temple demanded the continuation of prophecy regardless of the cost to the individual. Each session was a descent into chaos, a ritualized confrontation with the limits of human endurance. The physical toll was compounded by the psychological strain. To witness the future in such vivid, immersive detail was to experience events as though they were happening in the present. The Pythia could feel the heat of fire consuming distant cities, the tremor of armies clashing on foreign plains, the anguish of betrayals within families she had never met. Her body reacted as if these horrors were her own. Her heart raced, her breath came in ragged bursts, and her muscles tensed as though to flee or resist. There are records of Pythias who emerged from trances pale, exhausted, and trembling for hours, sometimes days afterward. Sleep offered little respite, as the visions continued to haunt her dreams, looping endlessly, leaving no corner of her existence untouched by divine terror. Her suffering was not only ritualistic but also spiritual. The Pythia existed in a liminal space between mortal frailty and divine authority. She was a human being, subject to pain and fear, yet she carried the words of a god. This duality was a form of torment in itself. The reverence she received could never compensate for the relentless exposure to horrors no one else could perceive. In some accounts, she was described as having a haunted look in her eyes, as though she had glimpsed the machinery of fate and carried its knowledge like a burden too heavy for the human frame. Even in moments of rest, she could feel the aftershocks of her visions, subtle tremors in her body, whispers in her mind, shadows flickering at the edge of perception, a reminder that prophecy was never truly over, even when the trance ended. The temple rituals themselves were a form of crucifixion. The Pythia was isolated, often confined to specific chambers, her movements restricted, her days measured by devotion and preparation for the next trance. She could not indulge in ordinary comforts, Her diet was controlled, her interactions with others limited, her body treated as a sacred instrument rather than a living organism. Priests supervised every action from her ablutions to her intake of herbs, ensuring that the vessel remained pure and ready to endure the next encounter with divine terror. This constant regulation of the body reinforced the psychological toll as she became increasingly estranged from ordinary human experiences. Her existence was a series of escalating pressures: fasting, isolation, trance, collapse, and repetition, a cycle that eroded her physical and spiritual reserves. Yet, the Pythia's suffering also had a strange, transcendent beauty. There was a rhythm to the ordeal, a cadence that fused human fragility with divine purpose. Observers often described a hypnotic grace in her trembling, a luminous intensity in her eyes, and a haunting melody in the fragmented syllables that escaped her lips. Even in collapse, there was a profound aesthetic in her endurance, a testament to the human capacity to channel terror into insight. Her body became a living altar to the God she served, an instrument through which both revelation and horror flowed, blurring the line between pain and devotion, suffering and enlightenment. The physical agony extended beyond the immediate trances. Prolonged fasting, repeated exposure to the hallucinogenic fumes, and the relentless stress of visions could weaken the Pythia's body over time. Some accounts hint at premature aging, chronic tremors, and ailments that persisted long after her service ended. Her muscles stiffened, her skin became pale and fragile, and her mind, though sharp in prophecy, was susceptible to breakdown under constant psychic strain. This fusion of physical exhaustion and spiritual torment made the Pythia both revered and pitiable, a figure whose suffering was the invisible engine of Delphi's extraordinary influence. Despite the brutality she endured, because the temple demanded it and because the terror itself carried a form of sacred power. Each collapse, each tremor, each convulsive utterance was a sacrifice, a payment for the insight of the gods. Her physical and spiritual suffering became intertwined. One could not be alleviated without acknowledging the other. The Pythia's body, ravaged as it was, became a testament to the cost of seeing beyond the veil, a living monument to the fact that divine knowledge is never given lightly and is never without consequence. Even as she emerged from the trance, she carried with her both the burden of prophecy and the lingering terror of what she had seen. Her body ached, her mind reeled, and her spirit hovered between exhaustion and transcendence. She was simultaneously a victim and a conduit, a fragile human channeling forces that no mortal could fully comprehend or survive unscathed. The sacrifices she made were invisible to the worshippers who bowed in reverence, yet without them, the terrifying visions that shaped the destiny of nations would remain unspoken. Delphi's power, its allure, and its horror all rested upon the endurance of the Pythia, whose body and soul were the price of forbidden knowledge. In this way, the Pythia's existence was a constant negotiation with suffering. The physical, psychological, and spiritual tolls were intertwined into a crucible that forged both insight and torment. To sit on the tripod, to inhale the sacred mists, to endure visions of unimaginable horror, was to submit fully to a god whose will was inscrutable. And yet, it was precisely this total submission, this blending of fear, devotion, and endurance, that made the Pythia the living, trembling vessel through which Delphi's terrifying, sublime knowledge flowed into the human world. Delphi was a place of sacred terror, but it was also a place where human greed and ambition could fester in the shadow of divine authority. The temple's ethereal beauty, its marbled columns, and the mist rising from the sacred fissure all conveyed an aura of holiness, yet beneath that veneer lay a world rife with manipulation and intrigue. Priests and temple officials understood the Pythia's visions were not only feared but desired. They held power over kings, generals, and envoys who traveled from across the Mediterranean to seek guidance. This made Delphi a theater of ambition, where mortals exploited the very fear and awe that had been conjured by the god himself. Sacred prophecy became a commodity, and the Pythia, despite her terror and sacrifice, was often caught in a web spun by those who sought to use her words to their advantage. The priests, guardians of the temple's ritual knowledge, were both protectors and manipulators. They interpreted the Pythia's fractured utterances, translating her convulsed, incomprehensible words into prophecies that would be comprehensible, and sometimes profitable, to mortals. Historical accounts hint that these translations were not always faithful. Kings might receive assurances of victory, while generals were warned of betrayal, not necessarily because the Pythia foresaw these events, but because the priests chose to frame the vision to align with political agendas or financial gain. Delphi became a place where fear could be weaponized, where divine terror was filtered through human ambition, and where the Pythia's suffering was leveraged to consolidate worldly power. Envoys from foreign lands added another layer to the manipulation. They brought gold, gifts, and promises of alliance, all to extract prophecies that could tip the balance of power in their favor. Some came with honest intent, seeking guidance from Apollo himself, while others came with deception and cunning, willing to distort or selectively interpret any prophecy to serve their ends. The Pythia, already trapped in a liminal space between mortal and divine, was further ensnared in the ambitions of these visitors. Her visions were pure, terrifying, and unfiltered, yet their meaning was always subject to human interference. What the god intended could be reshaped, twisted, or silenced entirely, leaving her powerless to protect the truth from the corrupting hands of men. The consequences of such manipulation were immense. Wars were waged, treaties signed, and entire populations suffered because a prophecy had been framed in a certain way. The Pythia might foresee a betrayal, but the priests could soften its delivery, leaving rulers unprepared for the full scope of the danger. Conversely, a subtle threat could be exaggerated to instill fear, ensuring compliance or tribute. Delphi, the sacred heart of prophecy, became a theater in which human ambition exploited divine terror, and the Pythia's suffering was leveraged as a tool in political chess games that stretched across nations. Even the most pious worshippers were drawn into this cycle, believing they were receiving sacred wisdom while remaining unaware of the mortal machinations at play. This manipulation was not only external but internal. Priests and temple officials monitored the Pythia, instructing her in ritual behavior, diet, and movement, controlling when she could speak and how her visions were delivered. She became a living instrument, her body, mind, and spirit calibrated to produce prophecy on demand. The demands were relentless. To refuse was sacrilege, to misstep was to risk punishment or exile, and to question the authority of the priests was unthinkable. In this environment, the line between divine terror and human cruelty blurred. The Pythia's suffering, already immense due to the visions themselves, was compounded by the constant manipulation of her words, the surveillance of her body, and the exploitation of her pain for the profit and power of others. Corruption extended even to the temple's political function. Delphi was central in the Mediterranean political landscape. A king's war could be swayed by the oracle's words, a city's fate determined by her trembling utterances. This made the temple a nexus of intrigue, a place where human ambition intersected with divine terror. Envoys and rulers often attempted to influence the Pythia indirectly, through bribes, threats, or flattery aimed at the priests. In some cases, political factions within Greece used Delphi strategically, ensuring that the Pythia's prophecies would advance their interests while undermining rivals. The Pythia herself, despite her sacred role, could not fully escape these machinations. Her visions, terrifying and authentic as they were, became currency in a world governed by human desire and deception. The interplay between divine vision and mortal manipulation created a tension that made Delphi both magnificent and horrifying. Visitors came seeking the word of a god, only to leave entangled in the ambitions of men who understood how to bend fear to their will. The Pythia's terror was both authentic and exploited. Each prophecy was an act of vulnerability, a surrender of body and soul to forces that were both divine and human. Her words held immense power, yet their meaning was never entirely hers. She was a witness to divine truth, yet a pawn in a game of mortal ambition, and the psychological strain of this duality added another layer to her suffering. Even in moments of private reflection, the Pythia could not escape the reach of corruption. The priest's control over her life extended beyond the temple. They regulated her diet, her interactions, and even her social relationships, ensuring that the vessel of prophecy remained pure and pliable. Her very existence was a negotiation between the terrifying visions she endured and the exploitation she could not avoid. To survive was to submit entirely to forces she could neither refuse nor influence, a reality that sharpened both the terror and the awe of her position. Delphi was a theater where sacred horror and human greed intertwined, and the Pythia stood at the center, trembling, suffering, and yet illuminating the fates of men and nations alike. There is a paradox in the corruption of Delphi. The temple's human manipulators profited from fear and ambition, yet their exploitation could never diminish the Pythia's terrifying connection to the divine. Her visions were authentic, brutal, and unmediated, regardless of how they were framed for human consumption. In this sense, Delphi remained a place of awe, horror, and revelation. The human hand could twist, delay, or embellish, but it could never fully control the raw, violent clarity of the Pythia's experience. Her suffering and courage continued to anchor the temple's power, reminding all who visited that while men might manipulate, the divine remained untouchable, indifferent, and terrifying. In the end, Delphi was a mirror for the duality of human ambition and divine terror. The Pythia's body and mind bore the cost of prophecy, the priest's manipulation amplified human greed, and yet the visions themselves remained untamed and sublime. Kings, generals, and envoys may have come to exploit the oracle, but in doing so, they entered a space where their ambitions collided with the raw, unyielding forces of the divine. Delphi was both a sanctuary and a crucible, a place where terror, beauty, and corruption fused into a terrifyingly sublime experience, and the Pythia's endurance was the invisible engine that made it all possible. The visions of the Pythia were not fleeting or simple, they were persistent, recurring nightmares that haunted her long after she left the tripod. These were not ordinary dreams that fade with the morning light. They were vivid, immersive experiences that replayed themselves with relentless insistence, as though Apollo's gaze had etched them into her very soul. She would awaken trembling, heart pounding, sweat clinging to her body, and yet the images would not dissipate. Serpents with scales that gleamed like molten metal, shadows that twisted into impossible shapes, fires that devoured cities in impossible geometries. These were the motifs that returned again and again, each recurrence slightly altered, each more terrifying than the last. The Pythia's mind became a haunted theater, where the boundary between memory, prophecy, and nightmare dissolved into a relentless cycle of fear. Some visions were monumental in scale, almost cosmic. The Pythia would see the collapse of mountains, the upheaval of seas, or the sudden disappearance of entire civilizations. Yet even within these vast disasters, there were intimate horrors that struck at the core of human emotion. She would witness the betrayal of close friends, families destroyed by greed or envy, lovers turning to murder, children succumbing to disease. Each vision was layered, a cruel combination of macro and micro, a universe where human and cosmic suffering intertwined. She experienced not only the physicality of these events, the heat of fire, the shock of impact, the weight of collapsing walls, but the emotional resonance as well, despair, grief, and rage coursing through her body as if it were her own. Recurring motifs haunted her more than the events themselves. Serpents appeared in countless forms, coiling through air and stone, whispering secrets she could not understand, striking unseen victims, or writhing through impossible geometries that defied natural law. Shadows slithered across her vision like living predators, their forms morphing into faces of the living and the dead. Fire did not merely burn, it danced in impossible patterns, consuming without heat, illuminating horrors that should not exist. Even the very architecture of Delphi, columns, pedestals, the fissure itself, became a stage for her nightmares, reshaping and twisting in ways that reflected the chaotic logic of the visions. To wake and see the world as normal was almost unbearable. It seemed too calm, too orderly, a cruel contrast to the reality her mind had inhabited. Psychologists of the modern era might speculate that the Pythia endured a form of trauma unlike any other. Her hallucinations, triggered by sacred fumes, were enhanced by isolation, fasting, and the relentless psychological pressure of prophecy. The repetitive nature of the visions created an environment where the brain could not distinguish between external reality and the internalized horrors of divine sight. Each recurrence reinforced fear, creating a feedback loop that eroded the boundary between waking life and vision. For the Pythia, sanity itself became fragile, a fragile veneer masking the terror that lay beneath. Even when the temple was empty, the echoes of her nightmares haunted her, ensuring that Apollo's influence never truly ceased. The recurring visions were also deeply symbolic. Serpents often represented betrayal or hidden danger, fire symbolized both destruction and purification, shadows were the unknown consequences of human action. These motifs were not simple allegories, they were intensely personal, reshaped by the Pythia's own fears, memories, and subconscious mind. Her mind became a canvas upon which the divine painted in a palette of horror and revelation. Yet the symbolic nature of the visions did not make them less terrifying. If anything, it heightened the tension. The Pythia could interpret the meaning only partially, never fully certain whether what she saw was literal, metaphorical, or both, and whether her interpretations would save lives or doom them. The isolation imposed by her role intensified the torment. The Pythia could share her visions only through priests who translated her fragmented utterances into prophecy. Even then, the true horror of what she had witnessed was inaccessible to others. She lived in a world where she alone bore the full weight of divine insight, yet she could not warn or console those who would be affected by the knowledge. This isolation created a profound psychological pressure, a sense of responsibility so immense it became almost a form of torture. The Pythia's nightmares were not merely images, they were moral imperatives, impossible truths she had to carry without relief or recognition. Sometimes the visions took on a terrifyingly interactive quality. She would feel as if she were physically inside the scene she observed, running with fleeing villagers, dodging falling debris, or sensing the heat of fire consuming her body. The sensory immersion was so complete that her body responded as if the events were real. Muscles tensed, breath quickened, and panic surged as though the destruction around her were tangible. The distinction between observer and participant vanished, making each vision a total experience of terror. These moments were particularly damaging psychologically, leaving her exhausted, disoriented, and vulnerable to further visions that might arrive even without inhaling the sacred fumes. Despite the horror, there was a strange, haunting aesthetic to the nightmares. The Pythia's visions were terrifying, yet they were also compelling, even beautiful in their surreal geometry, color, and rhythm. She saw patterns in chaos, a form of divine artistry that combined destruction and symmetry, horror and beauty. Observers of the Pythia often remarked on the luminous intensity in her eyes, the ethereal cadence of her voice, and the hypnotic grace of her movements. This aesthetic quality did not reduce the terror. If anything, it made it more potent, creating a tension between dread and awe that reinforced the sacred authority of Delphi. Recurring nightmares were not merely a personal affliction, they were a source of authority. The terror she endured validated her role, demonstrating that she was more than human, a vessel chosen to endure what no mortal could. The Pythia's suffering, amplified through repetition, became a form of sacred proof. Those who witnessed her trembling, her voice breaking, her body contorting under the weight of visions, understood that they were in the presence of someone who had seen the unseeable, touched the untouchable, and returned with knowledge that could alter the course of kingdoms. Apollo's hand, terrifying and indifferent, left its mark not only in the visions themselves but in the very being of the Pythia, ensuring her authority was absolute. Yet the psychological cost was immense. Sleep offered little relief, as nightmares followed her beyond the temple walls. She could not forget the patterns of destruction, the serpents, the shadows, or the fires. Even mundane events could trigger fragments of visions. A flickering candle might evoke flames consuming a city, a shadow across the floor might conjure a lurking threat. Her waking hours were a continuation of the nightmare, a reminder that prophecy is not a momentary gift but a permanent alteration of perception. The Pythia's life was defined by this persistent terror, a constant reminder of the fragile boundary between human consciousness and divine revelation. In the end, the recurring visions of the Pythia revealed the true cost of prophecy, It was not merely knowledge of the future, but a relentless confrontation with the raw, chaotic, and terrifying machinery of fate. The nightmares were a crucible, shaping her mind and body into a vessel capable of withstanding the horror of foresight. Delphi's power rested upon her endurance, her suffering, and her ability to translate visions that were as terrifying as they were sublime. Through repetition, terror became authority, horror became awe, and the haunted mind of the Pythia became the conduit through which the divine communicated with a mortal world that could barely comprehend the depth of what had been seen. The age of prophecy was not meant to last forever. Like all things born of fear and reverence, Delphi's power began to decay, not suddenly, but slowly, like a sacred flame starved of air. The whispers that once echoed through the marble halls grew faint, the fumes that once carried the god's voice became thin, and the world beyond the sanctuary began to change. Empires rose and fell, religions shifted, and new gods demanded the devotion that once belonged to Apollo. Yet within the temple, the Pythia still sat trembling upon her tripod, even as the fissure beneath her cooled and the air grew still. The divine silence that descended upon Delphi was not peace, it was suffocating, terrifying, a void that swallowed the voices that once guided kings and doomed empires. For centuries, the oracles had shaped the course of human history. They had foretold wars, guided colonization, and offered wisdom that bridged the human and the divine. But as Rome expanded its dominion, its pragmatic, militaristic worldview clashed with the mysticism of Delphi. Rationality began to erode the sanctity of the oracle. Skeptics and philosophers questioned whether Apollo truly spoke, or whether human cunning had masqueraded as divine will. The priests, once revered as interpreters of cosmic truth, found themselves cornered, forced to defend rituals that now seemed archaic in an empire obsessed with logic, conquest, and control. The same prophecies that once commanded armies began to be met with suspicion, even laughter. The divine voice was being replaced by the voice of empire. Within this transformation, the Pythia herself suffered the most. Her trances became erratic, her words uncertain. Where once her utterances carried the weight of thunder, they now emerged as fractured whispers, fragmented, hesitant, haunted by silence rather than revelation. Some said the god had abandoned her, others whispered that humanity had grown deaf to the divine. Without the intoxicating fumes, the trances became shorter, less intense, and increasingly hollow. The Pythia's body, once the vessel of Apollo's terror and majesty, now trembled in confusion, as though she were possessed not by divinity, but by the absence of it. The silence of the gods became its own kind of torment, a haunting inversion of the terror that had once consumed her visions. The priests tried to maintain the illusion of power. They orchestrated elaborate rituals, performed sacrifices, and spoke of new omens, yet beneath the ceremonial grandeur lay desperation. Donations dwindled, offerings grew smaller, and pilgrims who once traveled across continents now turned their devotion elsewhere. Christianity was spreading through the empire, carrying with it a new promise, salvation not through vision, but through faith. The world no longer needed the trembling woman on the tripod, it needed martyrs, saints, and dogma. Delphi's sacred terror, once a symbol of divine intimacy, was now branded as pagan madness, a relic of a time when gods demanded blood and humans sought meaning through fear. But what of the last Pythia? Her story is shrouded in mystery, yet fragments suggest a haunting end. When Emperor Theodosius banned pagan practices in the late 4th century CE, the Temple of Apollo at Delphi was officially closed. The last oracle, an old woman whose name has been lost to history, is said to have entered the temple one final time. She inhaled what little vapor still rose from the fissure and sat upon the tripod, though no one expected her to speak. The priests watched in silence as she trembled, her lips quivering, her body shaking in one final echo of the ancient trance. Then, in a voice frail but defiant, she uttered her last prophecy, not for kings or wars, but for Delphi itself. All is fallen, all is silent. The god is gone. Those words hung in the air like a curse. The silence that followed was unbearable. The priests wept, some fled, others lingered in disbelief. The marble columns that had once vibrated with divine energy now stood as hollow monuments to a vanished age. The sacred spring still flowed, but it no longer shimmered with mystery. The cave still breathed, but its exhalations were cold and lifeless. The temple that had once been the heartbeat of divine terror now became a tomb, not of bodies, but of faith. The death of prophecy was not a moment. It was a slow, mournful fading, a retreat of the gods from a world that no longer feared them. And yet, even in death, Delphi retained its power. The silence itself became symbolic, a haunting reminder of the cost of seeking forbidden knowledge. The ruins became a place of reflection, where travelers whispered about the oracles who had once trembled there, the women who had seen the future and paid with their sanity. The faint scent of sulfur that lingered in the air became an echo of the past, a spectral trace of the god who had once spoken through human mouths. Delphi's silence was not emptiness, but memory, the residue of terror, awe, and revelation that time could not erase. In that silence, humanity found its own reflection. The oracle's decline mirrored a deeper transformation, the shift from divine terror to human arrogance. The same species that once trembled before visions of the future now sought to control it. The same minds that once feared the will of the gods now sought to replace it with reason and empire. Yet the memory of Delphi endures, haunting the edges of history like a whisper from the abyss. It reminds us that knowledge, especially forbidden knowledge, has a price, that those who seek to see beyond the veil must be prepared to face the horror that lies there. The death of Delphi was, in truth, the death of awe. When the god fell silent, humanity lost more than a voice. It lost the ability to tremble. The Pythia's silence symbolized the end of an era when mystery still inspired fear and reverence. Now, only ruins remain, cold stone, fractured statues, and inscriptions worn by centuries of wind. But beneath those stones, the memory of the oracles still stirs, whispering faintly to those who dare to listen. The god may be gone, but the terror he inspired still lives in the human heart, echoing through the centuries as a reminder that the search for truth, divine or otherwise, is never free of consequence. The ruins of Delphi stand silent today, yet their silence speaks louder than any oracle ever could. The Pythia's trembling voice, her agonized trances, and the terrifying visions she endured are more than history. They are reflections of human curiosity, ambition, and vulnerability. She bore horrors no one else could perceive, suffering for the knowledge that shaped kingdoms and empires. In her agony, we see the ultimate cost of seeking what is forbidden, the price of glimpsing the future, and the fragility of human endurance in the face of forces beyond comprehension. Delphi's legacy is a study in contrasts, beauty and terror, devotion and exploitation, insight and madness. The Pythia's visions were sublime yet horrifying, her body and mind instruments of a god whose messages could dictate life and death. Even as kings and generals benefited from her words, they were oblivious to the suffering behind them. The moral weight of her role underscores a timeless truth. Knowledge is never neutral, and insight, particularly when derived from forbidden sources, exacts a profound cost. The nightmares she experienced were both personal and cosmic. Cities fell, rivers of blood flowed, serpents and shadows haunted every vision. Yet within the horror, there was awe. Patterns of chaos revealed themselves with strange beauty, showing the fragile connection between terror and revelation. The Pythia's endurance became her authority, her suffering a testament to the cost of true insight. She embodied the human confrontation with the unknown, a bridge between mortal fear and divine truth. Even in the silence of Delphi, the lessons remain. The pursuit of forbidden knowledge, the urge to peer beyond the veil, persists in humanity today. In science, in philosophy, in the search for truths too vast to comprehend. Delphi reminds us that to seek understanding is to risk the very stability of the mind, that insight carries responsibility, and that the price of seeing what others cannot is often invisible yet immense. Ultimately, Delphi's enduring power lies not in ruins or inscriptions, but in the human experience it represents, terror and awe intertwined, suffering transformed into wisdom, and courage tested at the edge of comprehension. The oracles, through their trembling, their visions, and their sacrifice, teach us that to confront the unknown is both perilous and sublime. To tremble before it is not weakness, but the truest measure of human courage, and in that trembling lies the haunting, timeless beauty of Delphi.